Okay, let's dive right in. I want you to picture Europe in 1913. It's a continent sitting at the absolute peak of its industrial, economic, and cultural progress. Seriously, if you were walking the streets of London, Paris, or Berlin back then, you'd see booming trade, rapid technological advancements, and just this general sense of unparalleled prosperity. You'd probably think you were living in the golden age of human civilization. But here's the crazy part. Without even knowing it, these nations were standing right on the precipice of what would become the deadliest conflict in human history up to that point. In this explainer, we're going to look at the massive, glaring contrast between the surface stability of 1913 Europe and the hidden, underlying powder keg tensions that were about to blow the whole thing wide open.
Years before World War I even broke out, the late 19th century German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck took a hard look at the geopolitical landscape and made this incredibly ominous and, spoiler alert, highly accurate prediction. He literally said, "Some damned foolish thing in the Balkans will set it off." It perfectly captures the dramatic irony of our whole story today. Because despite all the treaties and despite all the newfound wealth, these deep, hidden tensions were completely shattering the illusion of peace. And the smartest diplomats, they absolutely saw it coming.
Part 1. The Facade of 1913, Progress versus Paranoia.
So there was this massive core contradiction happening at the time. If we just peel back that wealthy, shiny, industrialized surface of Europe, we reveal some incredibly dangerous ideologies brewing right underneath. On one hand, sure, you've got unprecedented industrialization, global trade networks, and massive wealth. But that exact same industrial wealth completely masked the rise of these dark worldviews. Chief among them was social Darwinism. This was a grim, pseudo-scientific belief that the survival of the fittest evolutionary laws applied to human societies, and because of that, warfare was actually a necessary, positive test of national vitality. Pro-war advocates literally believed that fighting and winning in combat was the only way to stop a nation from stagnating. So industrialization didn't just build factories, it basically accelerated an arms race, fueled by this highly militant mindset.
And adding fuel to that ideological fire was something called revanchism. It's essentially a political movement entirely dedicated to reclaiming lost territory. In France, right after their defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, this became a massive cultural force. Movements like the Ligue des Patriotes, which started up in 1882, fostered this deep generational resentment. They literally went into schools and blacked out the lost provinces of Alsace-Lorraine on geography maps. Just imagine the psychological impact of that on a kid. It symbolized a permanent, unyielding grievance against Germany, completely normalizing the idea that a future war of revenge wasn't just possible, it was necessary.
Part 2. Clash of the Titans, the Imperial Arms Race.
Let's zoom out to the macro level for a second to see how this all played out among the major empires. You've got the British, French, German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires, all jockeying for position. And this was heavily accelerated by the German Kaiser Wilhelm's aggressive Weltpolitik, a foreign policy specifically aimed at securing Germany's place as a dominant global colonial power. We can actually look at some advanced probabilistic modeling from historical ML research to quantify just how tense things were. Based on Germany's economic, naval, and industrial indicators around 1890, a fair predicted share of African colonial territory for them would have been about 18.1%. But the historical reality? They only held 8.7%. The data highlights a massive 107.9% discrepancy. This gives us quantified proof that Germany's economic might vastly outpaced its actual colonial holdings. It wasn't just some perceived slight. It was a real, structural anomaly that bred intense colonial friction.
Which brings us to a frankly staggering number, 36.43. Researchers have calculated that this precise territorial anomaly generated a tension factor of exactly 36.43. But what does that actually mean for us? Well, it means this structural imbalance correlated heavily. We're talking a 0.79 correlation here, with a massive naval arms race. It forecasted a highly probable structural conflict. The math essentially guaranteed that this pressure cooker was going to blow. The empires were simply way too large, and their ambitions were way too mismatched.
Part 3. The Balkan Powder Keg, a microcosm of conflict. So where was this pressure cooker most likely to blow? Exactly where Bismarck predicted, the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire had been retreating from the region, leaving behind this highly volatile power vacuum, and aggressive nationalist states were more than eager to step up and fill it. To really understand the Balkans, you have to understand Pan-Slavism. It was an ideology seeking to unite all Slavic peoples in the region into one single nation. Russia saw itself as the great protector of the Slavs, so they heavily supported this movement. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire? They fiercely opposed it. Why?
because a unified Slavic state right on their doorstep would directly threaten their own imperial territories. Pan-Slavism combined with these irredentist movements trying to expand borders created a direct, unavoidable clash between Russian and Austro-Hungarian imperial interests.
And this ideological clash very quickly turned into actual bloodshed. In October 1912, the First Balkan War begins as a loose alliance called the Balkan League attacks the Ottoman Empire. Fast forward to May 1913, and the Treaty of London virtually ends Ottoman rule in Europe. But peace doesn't last at all. Almost immediately, in the summer of 1913, the Second Balkan War erupts. Those former allies literally turn their guns on each other over how to divide up the spoils, particularly Macedonia. By the August 1913 Treaty of Bucharest, the map had been completely redrawn again, leaving everyone, especially Serbia and Austria-Hungary, bitter, heavily armed, and deeply suspicious of one another.
Part 4. The Breakdown of Diplomacy. My co-hosts and I were discussing this earlier, trying to figure out exactly why diplomacy was completely failing, despite all the era's progress. We realized that following the Napoleonic Wars, Europe had heavily relied on this balance of power concept to prevent major conflicts. But by 1913, that system was basically disintegrating in real time.
We see the division of Europe into two very rigid and often completely secret alliances. On one side, you have the Triple Entente made up of Britain, France, and Russia. And on the other, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. My co-host made a fantastic point about this. They pointed out that while these alliances were technically designed for defense, they actually created a terrifyingly fragile web. It meant that any localized dispute, like some random conflict popping up in the Balkans, could instantly trigger a massive global response, dragging all these interconnected empires right into the fight.
And it wasn't just the treaties pulling them apart. It was the military hardware itself. The Anglo-German naval race and the launch of the HMS Dreadnought completely shifted the balance of power. The Dreadnought was a total game-changer. Britain had this strict two-power standard, meaning their navy had to be bigger than the next two largest navies combined. So when Kaiser Wilhelm decided Germany suddenly needed a massive fleet to secure its place in the sun, it directly threatened Britain's core security. Germany's naval expansion critically alienated Britain, pushing them right into the arms of France and Russia. It was just a massively self-defeating strategy by the Germans.
And as my co-host noted, we see that self-defeating strategy play out again with the Moroccan crises in 1905 and 1911. Germany deliberately engineered these crises to test and hopefully break apart the new friendship between Britain and France. But it backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking them apart, it terrified Britain and France into solidifying their entente cordiale even more. So to summarize this whole diplomatic failure, Germany's aggressive Weltpolitik ended up creating the exact nightmare scenario they feared. They created a crumbling balance of power where they were essentially encircled and completely isolated. The whole diplomatic system was pushed right to the absolute edge.
Part 5. The Spark and the Inevitable Explosion.
By this point, the wood was stacked, and the gasoline was poured in the form of entrenched militarism and rigid alliances. All the continent needed was a single spark. And that spark finally came in June 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist with the Young Bosnia movement. Austria-Hungary, completely fed up with Serbian nationalism and desperate to secure their empire, utilized this as a strict casus belli, a justification for war. They issued the July ultimatum to Serbia. This was a list of extreme demands deliberately designed to be unacceptable, specifically demanding Austrian involvement in Serbia's internal judicial inquiry. When Serbia refused that one single point, Austria-Hungary had the exact excuse they needed to invade.
What followed was an unstoppable, basically mechanical domino effect of military mobilizations. Step 1, Austria-Hungary invades Serbia. Step 2, Russia, driven by that pan-Slavism we talked about, mobilizes to protect the Serbs. Step 3, Germany, feeling bound by the Triple Alliance and absolutely terrified of fighting a two-front war, backs Austria-Hungary and mobilizes against Russia. Step 4, because of the Entente, France and ultimately Britain are pulled directly into the fray. This demonstrates the terrifying reality of inflexible alliance systems. Once that train started moving, the diplomatic brakes were totally useless.
And here is a final nail in the coffin: the execution of the Schlieffen Plan. Germany knew that fighting Russia in the east and France in the west at the exact same time was a logistical nightmare. So their strategy was to preemptively attack and quickly defeat France by sweeping through neutral Belgium before the massive Russian army could fully mobilize. But the execution of this plan, violating Belgian neutrality, was the direct trigger that forced Britain to officially declare war on Germany on August 4, 1914. This effectively cemented a localized Balkan dispute into a full-blown world war.
This brings us to a final question I really want you to think about. Is our modern, highly interconnected world immune to a similar catastrophic chain reaction? We've just seen how a facade of economic progress, booming trade, and wealth in 1913 completely failed to stop deeply entrenched militarism, structural inequality, and rigid alliances from exploding. Understanding the mechanics of the 1913 Powder Keg matters profoundly today, because it reminds us just how fragile geopolitical systems truly are. When tensions are simmering and alliances are strict, the next damned foolish thing could always be right around the corner. Thank you for joining us for this explainer, and keep questioning the surface of history.